The morning Grace Bennett went down the loading dock stairs, I heard the crash before I saw her, and some part of me knew before I even turned around that my life had just split into before and after. My name is Nathan Cole. I'm 36, and I run inventory for Ridgeline Supply, a lumber and hardware warehouse on the edge of town that smells like sawdust and diesel every single day of the year. I've worked there for 11 years. Long enough to know which forklift sticks in reverse, which manager actually listens, and which coworkers you can trust with a secret. Long enough to have stopped expecting my life to change in any real way. Grace started 6 months earlier, working the front counter and handling client orders. She was 7 months pregnant by the time the accident happened, moving slower every week, one hand always resting under her belly like she was holding a conversation with somebody only she could hear. She was quiet at work. Polite. The kind of person who said thank you to everyone, even the guy restocking pallets who barely looked up. I liked her before I ever thought about her as anything other than a coworker. That mattered later. It meant what happened wasn't built on nothing. I didn't know much about her outside those four walls. I knew she was due in early spring. I knew she drove an old silver sedan with a cracked taillight she kept meaning to fix. I knew she laughed at things quietly, almost like she was embarrassed to be caught enjoying herself. What I didn't know, not yet, was that she was doing all of it alone. That Tuesday started like any other. Cold morning, frost still silver on the parking lot, the kind of day where everybody moves a little slower and complains a little louder. I was checking a shipment manifest near the loading dock when I heard her voice call out for someone to grab a clipboard from the office. Then I heard her boot catch on the metal stair tread. Then I heard the sound no one wants to hear, a body hitting concrete. I dropped the clipboard I was holding and ran. She was on the ground at the bottom of the steps, one leg twisted wrong beneath her, both hands pressed flat against her stomach like she could shield the baby from the fall by sheer will alone. Her face had gone the color of old paper. Grace. I dropped to my knees beside her. Don't move. Don't move yet. The baby, she said, and her voice cracked in a way that scared me more than the fall itself. Nathan, is the baby okay? I didn't know. I couldn't know. But I said the only thing that made sense in that moment. We're going to find out right now. I've got you. Somebody had already called for the warehouse manager, and within 4 minutes an ambulance was pulling into the lot, lights turning the gray morning red and white. I rode with her because when the paramedic asked if there was family who could come, Grace looked at me with an expression I'll never forget, somewhere between panic and apology, and said there wasn't anyone else to call. That sentence stuck to me the whole ride to the hospital. There wasn't anyone else to call. At the hospital, they ran monitors, ultrasounds, blood pressure checks, more forms than I thought a human body could generate. I sat in the hallway outside her room because I wasn't family and had no right to be inside, but I wasn't about to leave either. An hour later, a doctor came out and told me the baby's heartbeat was strong, no signs of distress, but Grace had fractured her ankle in the fall and would need a boot and crutches for at least 6 weeks. Given the pregnancy, they wanted her resting as much as possible and off her feet whenever she could manage it. 6 weeks. 7 months pregnant. Alone. When they finally let me back into the room, Grace was sitting up in the hospital bed with a hard plastic boot already fitted over her foot, staring at the ceiling like it owed her an explanation. "Hey," I said quietly. She looked over, and for a second her whole face folded into something raw. "I'm sorry you had to be here for this. Don't apologize for falling downstairs. That's not a character flaw." That got half a smile out of her, tired and small, but real. "The baby's okay. That's the only thing I actually care about." "I know." I pulled a chair closer to the bed. "You said there's nobody else to call." "I'm not trying to pry. But is that true?" Her hands twisted the edge of the hospital blanket. "My parents are gone. I moved here for a fresh start after things fell apart with the baby's father. I don't really have people here yet. I was going to build that. I just hadn't gotten around to it before my body decided to throw itself down a staircase." I sat with that for a second. 7 months pregnant, freshly injured, and completely on her own in a town where she barely knew anyone. That kind of loneliness has a weight to it. I'd felt versions of it myself after my own divorce 3 years back, evenings so quiet the refrigerator hum felt like company. I recognized it in her the way you recognize whether you've lived through before. Okay, I said. Then you've got me until you build the rest of it. She blinked like she hadn't expected that. Nathan, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. That's kind of the point of offering. She looked at me for a long moment, like she was deciding whether to trust the offer or brace for it to disappear later. Finally, she nodded, slow and careful, the way people nod when they're too tired to argue and too scared to say no. Okay, she said. Thank you. I didn't know yet what I was signing up for. I just knew I wasn't going to let her go home to an empty apartment on crutches with a baby coming in 2 months and nobody checking whether she'd eaten dinner. That first week, I showed up every evening after my shift with grocery bags and takeout containers, because between the boot and the belly, standing at a stove for more than 10 minutes had become its own kind of impossible. Her apartment was small and neat, decorated in soft yellows and a half-finished nursery corner with a crib still in its box, leaning against the wall like a promise she hadn't gotten around to keeping yet. The first night, she tried to insist she was fine. I can manage, she said from the couch, crutches propped against the armrest, foot elevated on a stack of pillows. I set a bag of groceries on her counter and started unloading it anyway. I believe you can manage. I'm not here because you can't. I'm here because you shouldn't have to. She watched me put away her groceries like the sentence had rearranged something in her chest. That's a strange distinction. It's the only one that matters. I closed the cabinet. You want soup or the chicken thing? There's a chicken thing. There will be, if you tell me where your pans are. She laughed, actually laughed, the first real one I'd heard since the accident. Bottom drawer. Left of the stove. That became our rhythm. I cooked, she directed from the couch with her leg propped up, calling out instructions about seasoning like she didn't trust me not to ruin dinner, which, fair, some nights I nearly did. We ate together at her small kitchen table, talking about nothing important. Work gossip, a documentary she'd half-watched, whether the baby preferred to kick during thunderstorms, which she swore was true and I refused to believe until I felt it myself one night, my hand resting flat against her belly at her insistence, and felt the unmistakable thump of a tiny foot against my palm. See, she said, grinning at my expression. Storm baby. That's the wildest thing I've ever felt. Wait until they're actually born. Then you'll really be amazed. I didn't correct the way she said you'll, like I was already part of the plan for after. I liked it too much to point it out. Word got around the warehouse fast, the way it always does in a place where 40 people spend 8 hours a day within earshot of each other. By the second week, I was catching looks from a few of the guys on the floor, half curious, half something closer to judgment. Ronnie Fisk, who ran the forklift crew and had never met a roomer he didn't want to expand, cornered me by the break room one afternoon. Heard you've been playing nurse over at Grace's place, he said, grinning in a way that made my jaw tighten. I've been bringing her groceries because she's on crutches and 7 months pregnant. That's not a scandal, Ronnie. That's a Tuesday. Sure, sure. He held up both hands like he was surrendering, though his smirk said otherwise. Just saying, men doesn't usually do all that for a coworker unless there's something else going on. Then maybe you've just never worked with decent people. I walked away before he could push it further, but the comment sat in my chest longer than I wanted it to, mostly because some small, honest part of me wondered if he was right. I hadn't let myself examine why I looked forward to those evenings the way I did. Why I found myself checking my phone during my lunch break to see if she'd texted. Why the sound of her laugh had started to feel like something I wanted more of, not less. I didn't say any of that to Grace. Not yet. It felt too fragile, too easy to misread given everything she was carrying. So I kept showing up, kept cooking dinner, kept driving her to doctor's appointments because her ankle made pressing the gas pedal risky, kept my feelings folded up small and quiet where they couldn't complicate anything. The appointments were where I started to understand how alone she'd really been before I showed up. At her third checkup with me driving, the nurse handed her a stack of paperwork and asked, almost automatically, if her husband or partner would be joining them in the room. Grace's hand tightened slightly around the clipboard. It's just me. And my friend Nathan, if that's all right. The nurse glanced at me, then nodded and waved me in without another question. Inside, the doctor moved the wand across Grace's stomach, and the room filled with the fast, steady whoosh of a heartbeat. Grace's eyes went glassy every single time, no matter how many times she'd heard it before. Strong heartbeat, the doctor said. Growing right on schedule. Grace exhaled like she'd been holding her breath the whole appointment. I reached over without thinking and squeezed her hand. She squeezed back, harder than I expected, and didn't let go until the doctor finished. Afterward, in the parking lot, she leaned against the car and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. "You didn't have to come in with me," she said. "I wanted to. Most people wouldn't want that. It's a lot. Doctors' offices, ultrasounds, somebody else's baby." "I don't think of it as somebody else's baby," I said, before I could stop myself. "I think of it as your baby. And I like being there when you find things out about them." She stared at me for a long second, the wind picking up strands of her hair, her hand still resting on her belly. "Nathan. You don't have to say anything," I said quickly, suddenly aware I'd said more than I planned. "I just wanted you to know." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, quietly, she said, "I'm glad it's you who found out about the fall first. I don't think I could have handled that morning with anyone else." It wasn't a confession of feelings. It wasn't even close. But it felt like a door left slightly open instead of shut, and I drove her home that day replaying the sentence more times than I'd admit to anyone. 3 weeks into her recovery, the baby's father showed up. I wasn't there for it. Grace told me about it that night, her voice tight and controlled in the way people talk when they're trying very hard not to fall apart. His name was Derek. They dated for a year and a half before she got pregnant, and according to Grace, he disappeared almost the moment she told him, citing timing, career plans, a version of his future that apparently didn't include diapers or 3 a.m. feedings. He showed up at her apartment that afternoon, unannounced, wearing a jacket that looked more expensive than anything in her closet, and told her he'd been thinking about things. "He said he wants to be involved," Grace told me, sitting at her kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking. "Not with me. With the baby." He used the word optics, Nathan. He actually used the word optics, like being a father is a marketing decision. I sat down across from her, keeping my voice level even though something hot was building in my chest. "What did you tell him?" "I told him he doesn't get to disappear for 7 months and then show up because it looks better for whatever version of his life he's building now." Her hands shook slightly around the mug. "He said I was being emotional. That pregnancy makes women irrational." I had to breathe through that one before I trusted myself to speak. "You are the least irrational person I know. You've been running numbers on formula prices and daycare costs since week 2 of your recovery. That's not irrational. That's exactly the opposite." She looked up at me, eyes wet but her jaw set with a kind of stubborn strength I'd come to recognize as entirely hers. "He said he might come by again. Try to talk to me when I'm, in his words, calmer. If he shows up again and you don't want him here, you tell me. I mean that. Nathan, this isn't your fight. You made it my fight the day I carried your grocery bags into this kitchen." I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. "I'm not trying to replace anybody. I'm not trying to be something I haven't earned the right to be yet. But I am not going to sit quietly while somebody makes you feel small for surviving something he ran from." Her breath caught, and for a second neither of us moved. Then she turned her hand over beneath mine so our palms pressed together, fingers slotting into the spaces between mine like they'd been waiting for the invitation. "Yet," she repeated softly. "You said, not yet." I felt my face go warm. "Did I?" "You did." The corner of her mouth lifted, small and careful. "That's a specific word to use by accident." I didn't take it back. Maybe it wasn't an accident. The kitchen went quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing outside. Grace looked down at our joined hands, then back up at me, something soft and uncertain moving across her face. "I have a lot going on right now," she said. "A baby coming in less than 2 months. An ex who apparently discovered feelings the moment I stopped being convenient. A cast on my leg and about $400 less in savings than I'd like. I'm not exactly the easiest person to fall for right now." "I didn't ask for easy," I said. "I asked to be here. Those aren't the same thing." She let out a breath that was half laugh, half something closer to relief. "You're going to make this very hard for me to keep being careful." "Good," I said. "Careful's overrated." She laughed for real then, and the sound loosened something tight in my chest that had been sitting there since the morning she fell down those stairs. We didn't kiss that night. It didn't feel like the moment for it, not with everything else still unsettled around her. But something had shifted between us, quiet and undeniable, like a door not just left open but stepped through. Derek came back 4 days later, and this time I was there. I'd stopped by after work to drop off her prenatal vitamins from the pharmacy when his black SUV pulled up outside her building. He got out slowly, sunglasses pushed up into hair that looked expensively styled for a man supposedly worried about a baby he'd ignored for months. Grace stiffened beside me on the porch steps. "That's him. Do you want me to leave?" "No." Her hand found mine. "Stay." Derek walked up with the easy confidence of a man who'd never once considered that a room might not want him in it. He looked at Grace first, then at me, then at our joined hands, and something flickered across his face, annoyance dressed up as amusement. "Well," he said. "Didn't take long to replace me." "Nobody's replacing anybody," Grace said, her voice steadier than I'd expected. "You left, Derek. There's nothing here to replace." He ignored that, focusing on me instead. "And you are?" "Nathan. I work with Grace." "Right. The coworker." He said it like the word tasted bad. Funny how quickly coworkers become caretakers become whatever this is. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice level, the way I'd learned working a warehouse floor full of tempers that flared over nothing. "I showed up because she needed someone to. You had 7 months to be that someone and chose not to be." Derek's easy smile faded slightly. "This isn't your business. She's on crutches carrying your child alone in an apartment you never once helped pay for," I said. "You made it my business the day you decided optics mattered more than showing up." His face went red around the edges. He turned back to Grace. "I'm trying to do the right thing here." "You're trying to look like you're doing the right thing," Grace said. "There's a difference, and I learned it from you, so you should recognize it when you see it." For a moment, nobody spoke. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and went quiet. Derek looked between us, something calculating behind his eyes, like he was weighing whether continuing this conversation was worth the cost to his pride. "You'll want help eventually," he said finally. "Daycare isn't cheap. Neither is anything else that's coming." "I'll manage," Grace said. "I've been managing since the day you left." "With him?" Derek nodded toward me, something bitter in his tone. "With whoever chooses to stay," Grace said. "That's not a small thing, Derek. You'd know that if you'd ever tried it." He didn't have an answer for that. He stood there a second longer, jaw working like he wanted to say something cutting and couldn't quite find it, then turned and walked back to his SUV without another word. He drove off fast enough that gravel kicked up behind his tires. Grace exhaled slowly once the sound of his engine faded down the street. "I've been dreading that conversation for weeks. You handled it better than most people would have." I had backup. She looked at me, something softer replacing the tension in her face. "That helped more than you know. I meant what I said in there. About staying." "I know." She squeezed my hand. "I think I've known for a while." That night, I stayed later than usual. We sat on her couch with a documentary neither of us was really watching, her feet propped in my lap, my hand resting absently against her ankle brace. At some point she shifted, turning slightly toward me, and the space between us narrowed the way it had been threatening to for weeks. "Nathan," she said quietly. "Yeah. I'm scared this is happening too fast. Baby coming, X showing up, all of it at once." "We don't have to rush anything," I said. "I'm not going anywhere regardless of the timeline." She studied my face for a long moment, like she was checking the sentence for cracks and not finding any. Then she leaned in, slow enough that I had every chance to pull back if I wanted to. I didn't want to. When our lips met, it wasn't dramatic or rushed. It was quiet, careful, the kind of kiss that felt less like a beginning and more like an acknowledgement of something that had already begun weeks earlier, back on that hospital hallway floor when I refused to leave. When we broke apart, she rested her forehead against mine, breathing unsteady. "That's going to complicate the coworker thing." "I think the coworker thing complicated itself a while ago," I said. "I just finally caught up." She laughed softly, and I felt it against my chest, warm and real. The next 6 weeks moved faster than I expected. Her ankle healed enough for her to trade the boot for a brace and then, eventually, nothing at all. The nursery corner slowly filled in, crib assembled with my questionable help and her much better instructions, a mobile hung above it with tiny felt stars she'd sewn herself during the long evenings when standing wasn't an option but her hands still needed something to do. At work, the rumors kept circulating, but I stopped caring what Ronnie or anyone else thought about it. What Grace and I had built wasn't built to satisfy an audience. It was built in quiet kitchens and hospital hallways and long nights on a couch with her feet in my lap, far away from anyone who might have an opinion about it. Her water broke on a Thursday evening in early spring, 6 days before her due date, while we were in the middle of assembling a bookshelf for the nursery that neither of us had any real business attempting without instructions. Nathan. Her voice had gone strange, tight and careful. I think it's time. I looked up from the half-built shelf, screwdriver still in hand. Time like get me to the hospital, Nathan. I don't remember driving there. I remember the hallway lights, the sound of her breathing through contractions, the way she gripped my hand hard enough to leave marks and apologized for it between gritted teeth even as another contraction hit. I remember the nurses asking if I was the father, and Grace answering before I could, her voice fierce despite the pain. He's not the biological father, she said, but he's the only father this baby's ever going to know standing in this room. So yes. Treat him like it. Something in my chest cracked open at that sentence, wide and warm, and I held her hand tighter through the next contraction, through the next hour, through all the hours after that, until sometime near dawn a small, furious cry filled the delivery room and the exhausted, radiant look on Grace's face became something I knew I'd remember for the rest of my life. They placed the baby on her chest, a girl, red-faced and loud and perfect, and Grace looked up at me through tears with an expression that held no hesitation in it at all. Nathan, she said. Meet your daughter. I hadn't expected the sentence. I hadn't asked for it, hadn't assumed I'd earned it yet. But when she said it, something settled into place inside me that had been unsteady since my divorce 3 years earlier, some old ache finally finding its answer. Hi, I said, voice rough, reaching out to touch one tiny hand that curled instinctively around my finger. Hi there. We named her Lily, after Grace's grandmother, and I spent that first night in the hospital room in an uncomfortable chair that I wouldn't have traded for the world, watching the two of them sleep, understanding finally what people meant when they talked about a life changing overnight. Derek didn't come to the hospital. He sent a text 3 days later, asking about visitation logistics in the same careful, distant tone he'd used the whole time. Grace answered him fairly and clearly, laying out terms that were generous given everything, because she wasn't interested in punishing Lily for her father's absence. But there was no confusion in either of our minds about who Lily's family actually was. It wasn't defined by biology. It was defined by who showed up. A year later, we moved into a house together on the edge of town, close enough to the warehouse that I could bike to work on nice mornings, far enough from Derek's side of town that we rarely crossed paths. Lily took her first steps in the backyard that spring, wobbling across the grass toward Grace's outstretched arms while I filmed the entire thing on a phone with hands too unsteady to keep the shot level. I proposed that summer, not with some elaborate scene in front of an audience, but quietly, in the kitchen of the house we'd built our life in, while Lily banged a wooden spoon against a pot at the table and Grace stood at the stove making the same chicken dish I'd once cooked for her on crutches, back when neither of us had said out loud what we already felt. I've been thinking, I said, coming up behind her, about the day you fell down those stairs. She turned, spoon in hand, eyebrows raised. That's a strange thing to be nostalgic about. It's not nostalgia. It's gratitude. I pulled the small box from my pocket, and her breath caught immediately, spoon clattering into the sink behind her. That fall was the worst thing that happened to you that year. It was also the reason I got to know you at all. I don't know what that says about the universe's sense of humor, but I know I'm not interested in finding out what my life looks like without you and Lily in it. Her eyes filled instantly, and Lily, sensing the shift in the room the way toddlers always seem to, banged her spoon harder against the pot like she was providing percussion for the moment. Nathan, Grace said, voice thick. Marry me, I said. Not because you needed someone after Derek left. Not because I felt sorry for you on crutches. Because somewhere between grocery runs and doctor's appointments and that ridiculous bookshelf we never actually finished, I fell in love with you. And I want the rest of it. All of it. The ordinary Tuesdays, not just the dramatic ones. She said yes before I even finished opening the box, laughing through tears, pulling me down for a kiss while Lily shrieked with delight at the sudden commotion, clearly convinced the whole scene had been staged entirely for her entertainment. We got married that fall in the backyard of the house we'd built together. String lights hung between the trees, Lily in a tiny white dress toddling down the makeshift aisle with a basket of flowers she mostly just dumped on the ground in one enthusiastic motion. Ronnie from the warehouse floor showed up, having long since stopped making jokes about it, and even offered a surprisingly decent toast about how some of the best things start with somebody falling down and somebody else deciding to stay. He wasn't wrong. People ask us sometimes how we got together, expecting some tidy, simple story. Grace usually just says, "He caught me at the bottom of some stairs and never really let go." I usually add that I didn't set out looking for a family. I just showed up one Tuesday morning because someone I cared about needed help, and I kept showing up because I realized somewhere along the way that showing up was the whole point. Sometimes the biggest changes in your life don't arrive with warning. Sometimes they arrive as a crash at the bottom of a staircase, a phone call with nobody else to make it to, an evening spent cooking dinner for someone who insists she doesn't need the help. And sometimes, if you're paying attention, you realize the person you've been quietly falling for was standing right beside you the whole time, waiting to see if you'd notice. Have you ever fallen for someone while taking care of them? Has a hard moment in your life ever turned out to be the beginning of the best thing that ever happened to you? Tell me your story in the comments. And if this one hit you the right way, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.